All right, sorry about that. This thing was like running a software update, which is always annoying. I don't know why it chooses to do it right now, right? But okay, so let me just get this open. Everyone ready for break? Like 2 more days, 3 more days? Today and tomorrow, and if you have classes Friday. Not very many people have classes on Friday, but it's coming very soon. So today and tomorrow are always like the worst days of attendance of the year because everyone's ready to start spring break. So they started early, right? So I'm glad you're here. Thank you for being here. But we'll get going on chapter 11 today. We'll look at human development just a little bit. And we won't get into it too far, obviously, since it's kind of a long unit, so we'll cover it today and then when we come back. But remember, when we come back that Monday, I won't be here. Talked about it last time, just as a quick reminder, though. I had as a planned absence, so I have it on the syllabus and everything. But we'll get going today, and then we'll have spring break, and then I'll see you that Wednesday when we come back. So what we'll look at in this unit is we'll look at the topic of developmental psychology, which we sometimes call lifespan psychology. We're going to look at kind of how we change and grow and some of the unique pressures that we face throughout our lifespan. So we'll start with kind of before birth even, and some of the growth and processes that occur then. And then we'll move through childhood and infancy into the adolescent years and then the adult years, and then look at kind of the end of life or late life as well. Looking at some of the physical, cognitive, and social changes that happen along the way. And each age that we go through has different like pressures and milestones and things that tend to be hallmarks of it. And so those are some of the things that we will look at as we go. And there's a kind of an older song, but I think it does such a great job of kind of highlighting some of the things that we face at different stages. So I'll play it for you as a way to kind of start this. There's a newer one, but this one is a little bit better. So let me play this. I always have to pause this here. Here's my churro picture. But what I like about that video is I think it does, like I said, a really good job of kind of highlighting some of the things that happen along the way, right? As we're aging, right? Different ages come with different pressures. He talks about 15 being caught in between being 10 and 20, right? Being caught in between childhood and being an adult. And some of the kind of unique pressures that come with that, like looking ahead, dreaming forward. At 22, falling in love tends to be a big thing in our 20s, or meeting someone, falling in love with them. 33, becoming a they and forming a family, having children tends to be very common at that age. 45, heading into a crisis. People kind of reflecting on their midway point in their life, a midlife crisis or transition. And then as he gets into his 60s, he talks about wisdom and the sun getting high with that metaphor of like a day equating to a life. And then at 99, looking back and wanting just another moment. Right? So I think a really good way to kind of start thinking about some of those milestones that we progress through. And as I said, we'll start kind of at the beginning, right? The very beginning, if you will, but we'll work our way through and look at some of those big kind of things as we go along. And as a side note, I teach human sexuality every fall. Like if you wanted another class, that one's so much fun. I love that class, and we get to talk way more about all this, but we'll just kind of go over it quickly here. The moment of conception marks the beginning of a new cell, right? We won't get into when life begins. That's a huge like moral and ethical and sometimes religious debate, but we can talk about the beginning of a new cell here, where a single sperm cell from a male penetrates a single egg from a female, forming a new fertilized cell. And that when that cell becomes fertilized by that sperm, we call it conception. And that moment of conception is when the two come together and form this new cell. And from here, from this point, right, that cell is going to undergo just a massive number of changes over roughly 9 months or so to eventually evolve and become a little human being that will be born. But from this point, right, we have a single cell. You can see it penetrates the outer layer of the egg, which closes that egg off so that no other sperm can get in, right? And then we have this little thing that has to implant into the uterus wall in order for pregnancy to occur and progress. So from this moment on, as I said, we go through just an incredible amount of what's called prenatal development. Prenatal comes from pre-nasi, which in Latin means before birth. So that's what prenatal means, before birth, right? In that period of time where this little cell is developing and changing over a course of roughly 9 months. And I have 3 little kids, right? So I've gotten to see this happen twice because one of them was twins, but really incredible to watch this process unfold. It's just wild that you have this cell that goes from like the tip of your pen, right? The size of like something so microscopic and little to roughly the size of like a watermelon or a pumpkin by the time that they're born, like 8, 9 pounds or so typically. And so what we see is we progress, right? From the beginning, we're that little zygote, and that zygote is that fertilized cell for roughly like 2 weeks or so. And then it becomes a blastocyst, and then an embryo, and then a fetus. Right, so the embryo, if we write this up here, like I won't ask you what happens at each stage, but I might ask you the order. An embryo lasts until about up to 3 months. Right, so a zygote and a blastocyst are very quick stages, right? The zygote is what we call that new fertilized cell. A blastocyst is what implants into the uterine wall, and then it becomes this little embryo. And an embryo, or the embryonic period, lasts for about 3 months or 1 trimester. And then it's going to become a fetus, which is basically from 3 months to birth. And fetus is Latin for offspring or young one. And so again, I have some pictures of it here, and I have part of a little video that I'll share with you because I think it shows this really beautifully. But just so many changes from this tiny little cell dividing and replicating and multiplying, starting to specialize, forming the bones, forming the skin, forming all the organs and muscles and tissues that we possess. Again, over roughly 9 months until you have this little fetus that becomes born, and we have a little newborn baby. And there was a documentary, there's tons of documentaries on this, but I found a little excerpt from one that I'll show you. I'll warn you, there's a tiny bit of nudity in it. They do show her like stomach getting bigger as she progresses through pregnancy. But the real horror of it is there's like a little bit of salsa dancing at the beginning. And I left it in there because I had to watch it. So I left it in there for you to see. That's the worst part by far. Forget the nudity, it's the salsa dancing. But I'll play it for you. It's just a couple of minutes long. It's this short little kind of digital overview of what it would look like from the period of conception up to about 13 weeks. After 13 weeks, most of the development has taken place, right? And at that point, they're just growing and specializing and kind of finishing everything up. So let me show you what that looks like. And again, you can enjoy dancing at the beginning, right? But you can see in the images here, right? And also the ones in the video, we go from looking really like this tiny little cell to kind of like a little bit of an alien for a while, right? Some of these pictures, right? Especially like that one and that one here, we don't look very human yet, right? But we're developing and evolving and changing. And as you saw, by about 13 to 16 weeks or so, just about everything is formed, and then it's just finishing off. Right, so it's just an incredible amount of development and change. Somewhere around like 13 weeks or so on average, you can often start to be able to tell the sex of a baby. Sometimes around like 16 to 18 weeks, you can start feeling them move. You can hear their heartbeat somewhere around like 6 to 8 weeks, depending on the ultrasound technology that you're using. I have to tell you, when I first heard that we were having twins and I heard 2 heartbeats, that was crazy, right? I was like, oh my gosh, there's too many heartbeats already. I was overwhelmed already. But it's wild when you can hear that heartbeat for the first time or feel them move for the first time. But just an incredible amount of changes over the period of roughly 9 months or during that stage of pregnancy. And pregnancy, if we define it typically, right, is the carrying of offspring inside the uterus or the womb of a female. It's typically broken up into what we call trimesters. Now we have semesters, right, for our school system, right, 2 semesters. Trimesters are 3 periods of time, tri meaning 3. And so they're roughly about 3 months or 13 weeks each. So we have a first, a second, and a third trimester of pregnancy. And interestingly, right here is where the first trimester ends. So the first trimester ends after the embryonic period ends. And really at this point is when a lot of people wait to tell others that they're pregnant until they get to about like 12 or 13 weeks. Because most of the time you're kind of out of the woods a little bit with the dangers of pregnancy or of losing that baby. the most likely time for that to happen is during this first trimester, because that's when all those systems are developing and unfolding. If something is going to go wrong, it typically goes wrong during the first trimester. Now, not always, sometimes things can happen later on, but that kind of unborn baby or that embryo is most at risk for issues as all of those systems are starting to develop and unfold. During the time of pregnancy, the placenta is the organ that is connecting that woman to that baby, right? Everything that a woman ingests when she's pregnant goes directly to that fetus, right? And so that's why there's so many rules about what you can and can't eat or consume or do when you're pregnant, because everything that you do as that like mother, as that woman carrying the baby or babies, goes directly to them. What are some of the things you're not supposed to like eat or ingest or and stuff when you're pregnant? Yeah. Sushi, right? Any kind of like raw fish, really difficult to be broken down by the body, so it can be harmful for the baby. Did you have one as well? Alcohol, right? Alcohol or any drugs really can be so dangerous, right? It goes directly to that baby. Alcohol can cause all kinds of complications, just like cigarettes or nicotine can. Anything else that you have heard of or know that you're not supposed to consume? Yeah. Some spicy food can cause issues, right? Some of it is okay, but a little bit too much of it can cause typically more issues for the mom, right? Or for the woman carrying it, can cause a lot of problems breaking that down. There's certain like deli meats that you're not supposed to eat, or there's a lot of like caffeine's kind of an interesting gray area where you're not supposed to have too much of it, but you can't have some. There's a lot of rules, right? Trying to maintain the health of that baby, because everything that woman puts into their body goes through the placenta into that baby's like bloodstream and into their system. Even certain medications, right? A lot of medications are kind of on that dangerous list of things that you shouldn't take or consume because it's difficult for that baby to break down. Right? So that's why there are so many rules. There are toxic chemicals or toxic agents called teratogens that, if consumed by that woman or that mother, will go directly to the baby and can be very harmful. And typically during pregnancy, people are being monitored very heavily, right? They are going for ultrasounds and regular checkups. And typically pregnancy is most likely to have a favorable outcome when that woman or that mother is having good nutrition, good medical care, and they avoid those harmful substances as much as possible. Now, there's always the person who does nothing right and has like a perfectly healthy baby, and the person who does everything right and doesn't have a healthy baby. But for the most part, when you're taking care of yourself and you're avoiding these things and having good medical care and checkups and ultrasounds to monitor the baby's growth and development, things tend to go right in the right direction. Any comments or thoughts or questions or anything for the moment? My favorite part of when we were pregnant, I say I missed my chance to eat for like 2 or 3, right? I didn't carry our children. I have like such a low pain tolerance and I never wanted to carry kids, but my partner carried them. And so I supportively ate with her because I didn't want her to eat alone. I mean, I'm considerate like that. Right? I gained like 30 pounds when we had the twins. I was like, I will help you along the way. Every time you eat, I'll eat too. But interestingly, when you're going through this like process, every little week that you go through, the baby, they compare it to the size of a food. And that was my favorite part. It was every week we would take a picture with the food that matched the size of the babies. And it just kept getting bigger. It went from like a seed to a grape to a raspberry. And by the end, like 2 pumpkins. That's just wild to look at the difference between the two. So after roughly 9 months, right, typically 37 weeks, on average, 37 weeks or so is the amount of time for pregnancy. Now, very rarely are people actually born on their due date. It's typically somewhere within like 37 to 39 weeks or so on average. But after that period of time, right, we get a little neonate. Neonate means newborn, right? A newborn baby. Instead of prenatal, now we have neonate. Not a term that we tend to use very often, but still. And a newborn baby, right, comes equipped with very little, in a sense, right? A baby is 100% reliant on their caregivers in order to kind of successfully navigate the world around them. And one of the things that they do come equipped with are reflexes. Babies have a couple of very useful reflexes that help them to survive outside of the uterus. And these are really basic, but they're life-like altering in the sense that without these, they wouldn't be able to survive. One of them is called the rooting reflex. If you touch a baby's cheek, they will turn their head in that direction. And so if you touch their cheek with like a bottle or a breast, they will turn their head to that source of food. And that's just a very basic thing that they know how to do. They don't have to be taught. If you put something in a baby's mouth, they will suck on it, right? Which is good because it's the only way that they're able to eat when they're very little. They have to put either some kind of like either breast milk or formula into their mouth, and they all automatically know to swallow it. Again, these are very basic things, but without like the rooting, sucking, or swallowing reflex, that baby wouldn't be able to feed and eat and survive. The other ones are kind of a little bit less obvious in some ways. Like babies have a grasping reflex. They hold on to things very tightly. If you put your finger in a baby's hand, they will squeeze it, and they have quite a grip, right? Like babies, surprisingly for their size, right? They have a very strong grip. They also will often do like little precursors to walking. They'll move their legs as almost like they're trying to walk, even though they're long before the ability to do so. And they have startle and moral reflexes where they're like fan out their hands when they're scared, fan out their toes. There's all these little reflexes that babies come equipped with that again help them to survive. And some of them aren't as adaptive as others, like the ones at the bottom, but they continue to be things that we see that babies do possess. And I found a little video showing some of these reflexes, so I'll play it for you. But I think it's wild to think that, you know, these things seem automatic, but without them, again, we wouldn't be able to survive. So this is really brief, but I think it shows them nicely. I think it's a really good example. You can see some of these working. Again, they're so basic, but without them, we wouldn't be able to eat and survive and so on. Yeah, we'll go back there and yeah. Yeah, they start to recognize voices and then obviously faces. Yeah.
Some friends, at least when you show us that sometimes when like the mother does, like the dad needs to take off his shirt to have that like skin to skin contact.
Yeah.
So it's like the baby's being with his mother. But obviously they're not, but it's still cute.
Yeah, and they actually really strongly encourage that when a new baby is born. One of the first things that they have the parents do, and typically both parents do it, starting with the one who gave birth, like ideally like that person, but they have them put the baby on their bare skin. It helps to regulate the temperature of the newborn, and then it also helps with bonding. And so oftentimes they'll have the partner do that as well, whether they're male or female or whatnot, but they'll often have the other person do it. Like with our twins, I had to do that too, right? And so because my partner had one and I had the other, and swap. But oftentimes they have both people do that as a way of bonding and also regulating. And so babies very quickly learn the smell of their parents, the sound of their voice, and then eventually what they look like. At first, they can't see them very well. Babies can only see about this far in front of their face for a little while, and then it gets slowly a little bit bigger and bigger. But yeah, it's very true. They often have a very distinct recognition of their caregivers from smell, from touch, from sound, and then later sounds as well. Did you have a thought?
Is there a chance that baby could not have a reflex at the start?
Yeah, typically when babies don't show all of these things like from the beginning, it could be an indicator of an issue because they're typically very like inborn and automatic. And so when babies don't show like reflexes or responses that are typical right off the bat, it can be a little bit of a red flag that maybe there's a developmental or physical issue going on. Not always, but it sometimes is an indicator of a bigger problem because they do tend to be present in everyone. But they test babies very quickly after they're born on a whole variety of responses and how they're like reacting to things in the environment. And if they score poorly on those little tests, right, you're tested right off the bat, then it can be a little bit of a problem. Yeah.
If the baby is born maybe earlier according to the day,
Yeah.
is there a chance that they could have like a higher chance of having disability
Mhm.
later in life?
Yeah. So when babies are born are born early, they're premature. If it's a week or two early, typically the dangers are very, very low. Right. So on average, 37 weeks marks full term. right? For the most part, 37, 38 weeks. If a baby's born at like 36 weeks, typically they're okay and they might not have any issues. But you have babies born at like 33, 34 weeks. Sometimes they have to go to what's called a NICU, a neonatal intensive care unit, where they spend a period of time on like an incubator and the kind of finishing some of that growth and development. The earlier that they're born, the more likely the risks are there. I think the youngest baby to be born and survive was 24 weeks old, if I remember correctly, somewhere in that like range of like early 20s. And typically the farther that you are, the earlier that you are, the more risks there are going to be, because you haven't finished cooking yet, you haven't finished developing yet, right? And so oftentimes there are some more risks, and it can correlate to later in life problems as well if things haven't developed all the way. Any other questions or thoughts or anything? Yeah.
So does the baby decide when it wants to be born?
So interestingly, it's a combination of the two, right? Oftentimes what will happen is a woman's body will start those changes, whether or not, typically what happens is, and it's more than we need to get into, but just as a side note, right? So the cervix is closed up, right? And when a baby comes to be born, that cervix starts to dilate and open, and then it starts that process of labor. And so oftentimes when a woman gets close to the end of pregnancy, what they'll do is they'll ask them to minimize their activity level, be really kind of careful with some of the things that they're doing so that they don't accidentally trigger labor early. Now, some people will do things to trigger labor because they're ready and their baby's fully grown. But oftentimes it's a combination of like the mother and the baby's size can also play a role in that as well. But it's more the woman's body than it is necessarily the baby. And sometimes we have to trigger labor because the baby, that process doesn't start on its own. And so sometimes when people hit like 40 weeks, the doctors will have to give them a medication to cause labor to start in order to get the baby moving. Yeah.
How would that look?
What's that?
The manual labor
Like inducing labor? So often what happens is there's a drug called, you don't need to know this, but it's called Pitocin. And you give this drug to a woman. What it does is it starts the cervix to dilate and like have contractions. So basically it starts causing contractions to occur, things to open up. Another thing that sometimes they'll do in order to cause labor to happen is they will rupture a woman's bag of waters. If you've ever heard someone say someone's water broke, it's called a bag of waters technically. So the water surrounding the baby or the umbilical like cord and all of that fluid that's there, if you rupture that and cause a woman's water to break, you trigger labor to start. So oftentimes once your water breaks, you have 24 hours or less to deliver that baby without complications. So very rarely, you see it in the movies all the time, right? Someone's water breaks and then they go to the hospital. It actually oftentimes breaks during labor when you're in the hospital and pushing. So that's not as common as they make it seem. So you can do one of two things. You can give them hormones to cause labor to be induced. Sometimes it can be as simple as you make that person go on a walk and do some exercise, and the movement can sometimes cause contractions. Or it could be that you manually go in. It almost looks like a little crochet hook. Like you literally go in and almost like pop that little bag and the water breaks, and that can trigger the body to start labor. So there's a whole bunch of different ways they can do it. Medication's really common to get that process started. It takes about 48 hours once you give someone that medication for labor to progress. And worst case, or I won't say worst case, but oftentimes if the medications or those things don't work, then they'll do a C-section. So they'll go in and then they'll do a surgical removal of the baby, which might happen anyway if the baby's too large, or if they're twins, or if they're in the wrong position, and so on. Yeah.
So once the water breaks down, we can to get the baby out. So what happens if the baby doesn't get out?
They have no way of breathing. So that fluid goes into their lungs, and that's their oxygen. And so if there's no fluid in there, oftentimes, I mean, that could cause the baby to die because there's nothing there for that baby to be able to breathe. So when someone's water breaks, they need to get to the hospital. It's one of the hard rules of labor. When you have contractions that are lasting a certain amount of time and frequency, you go to the hospital, or if your water breaks, because once that water's gone, that's that baby's cushion and like fluid to help them breathe, and it becomes very dangerous without it. Yeah.
So you say that the water is what helps the baby breathe
Mhm.
while in the womb. Is it kind of more of a transition? So when water breaks and the baby is born, they transition to like oxygen outside the body?
It doesn't happen until they are literally out, right? So once they have come out of a woman's body and they take that first breath, that's when they really like go to that. But the idea behind there's some alternate methods of birthing. One of them is called water birthing, where you give birth to a baby in like almost like a big hot tub, but it's, it's all sterilized and not like a traditional hot tub. I'm not saying like in a hot tub at home, right? Just to clarify, but it looks like a hot tub in a sense. And so the baby comes out into water, and it's thought to be like a more calm and like humane transition, because the baby goes from being like inside a woman's body where everything is one way and like fluid is how they're breathing. They're born and they take that first breath of air and they scream and cry and they cough everything up out of their lungs. So at that point is when they really, harshly in a way transition to oxygen, like outside of the body. And they scream. Let me tell you, they cry like quite a bit right off the bat, right? And you want them to. That's their way. They're trying to clear everything out of their, of their body. They have all this stuff in their throat and in their mouth. They suction it all out in order to make sure they can breathe clearly. Anything else? Other baby questions? So from this point, so now we have a newborn baby. That baby is going to, obviously grow and develop and change incredibly over the lifespan, just like they do before birth. They continue to grow and develop afterward. There's a lot of physical development that happens after birth. And we see an incredible amount of brain and neurological development that happens starting right away, right? Very, very important that you give babies a lot of stimulation in order to help that neural growth and that mental growth to happen. And I'm sure you've heard this, right? It's a very common rule of like babies, you want to make sure that you're stimulating them constantly, whether that's people and voices and being held and touched. Eventually it's going to be toys and little things that they can hold on to. But babies go through just so much brain development starting from the moment of birth. And they're unfolding in their brain all of these different processes. They're causing brain development and neurological development, dendritic connections to form. And they're going through this process of what we call maturation, right? And their brain is maturing, their body is maturing. Again, babies are born very incomplete in a way. They literally, even their skull hasn't fused together all the way. Babies have a soft spot on the top of their head for a period of time where it still has to fuse together. And you can feel it, it's always a little weird. Like there's this weird little soft spot where the skull has to still fuse. They're still learning how to involve and like interact with the world. As I said, their senses are very, very limited in the beginning. And eventually, we also start learning sequences of motor development. And this is a big one that children go through, of course, just like anything else we're talking about. But kids follow this very like clear sequence in motor development skill. A newborn baby, if you were to put them in the middle of a bed and walk away, I'm not recommending it, but I'm just saying, if you put them in the middle of a bed and walk away, they can't go anywhere. They're not going to roll over. They're not going to fall off the bed. They literally cannot move from that spot. They can flail their arms and their legs, but they cannot roll over or move or crawl away. A newborn baby can't do any of that. But as they start to get a little bit older, you do what's called tummy time. You put them on their tummy and they'll do little like push-ups. They can start holding up their head a little bit, right? And they start to grow some of those muscles. By the time they're about 6 months old, they can actually sit up on their own. Right, so it takes almost 6 months to the point where they can sit on their own, support their own weight, hold their head up. Babies' heads are very, very heavy compared to the rest of their body. And so they have to build those neck muscles over those roughly first 6 months. Once they can sit up, they can start eating normal food, like soft baby foods. Before that, they typically only eat like breast milk or formula. Once a baby can sit, then they move to crawling. And these are averages, just as a side note. But somewhere around like 8 to 9 months or so, babies start to crawl. They explore the world through like a crawling like kind of behavior. Somewhere around 12 months, they begin to walk. And they start off with something called cruising. Oftentimes they'll hold on to like a table and they kind of like roll like this around it, like all the way around. And then eventually they start to take their first steps. And again, somewhere around like 15 months, they sometimes at that point can typically walk independently. But these are averages, and some babies are much faster and some are much slower. 2 of my kids were walking fully at 11 months. And then Paisley, my youngest, waited till about 15 months to try and walk. She was like a wicked good crawler, Like she could crawl across the room like so fast. And I don't think she wanted to try walking because she was so good at crawling. But my other two were walking at 11 months. And so again, as long as people are kind of following like roughly within this range, we don't worry. But if a baby isn't walking by like 15, 16, 17 months, it could indicate a problem, right? There are kind of normal stages of time. And when babies are like way too late or way too early, it can sometimes be a little bit problematic. But more than worrying about like the ages or the months, we tend to look at the progression. Babies follow this progression almost every time, right? They sit, then they crawl, then they cruise, and then they walk. Right? Very rarely would a baby like walk before they crawl. They just don't have the muscle ability to do that quite yet. So they follow a very orderly sequence of motor development. Yeah. You're so tiny. Yeah. Yeah. And some of it is just, random. Some of it is muscle, like, and like drive and motivation. Like we, from the beginning, were like, oh, Paisley's going to be lazy. Like, because she did, and she is. Like, I love her to death, obviously, but I can say that about her. Right? We call her lazy Paisley, not her face. Right, but like, she's always lazy. Like, she never wants to be lazy. And that was so true even with the walking as a baby, right? Like, she just wasn't in a hurry to do it. And then other kids, like my daughter, Emily, so motivated. I mean, like at 11 months, she would stand and she'd go like this, like trying to walk. It was the funniest thing. She'd just stand there, like, rock like this, too afraid to take that first step. Right. But she wanted so badly. You could just see it. She wanted to walk, like drive, and already ready to go. And she's very much like that even now. So some of it, I think, is very like motivation related, and others just random. Some babies are just early, and other babies are very late in the way that they do stuff and progress. And I wasn't prepared for how competitive this is. Parents are competitive with this, and it doesn't really matter in the end. If they're walking at some point, it doesn't really matter. But it's always the like, yeah, my baby stood at 3 months. My baby was walking at 3 months. I'm like, no, they were not. That's not possible. But you hear that stuff anyway all the time. So lots of motor development, physical development that's taking place. There's also an incredible amount of cognitive development. And I have to tell you, this is from a textbook. This is like the creepiest looking baby ever. I don't know what's happening with this baby picture, but I think it's a good example anyway, so I left it in there. But there's a lot of cognitive development that takes place for babies, right? They go through an incredible amount of physical growth and mental growth. And if you had children in your life in any capacity, whether they're yours or siblings or like family of any kind, babies and children, depending on what stage they're at, think about the world very, very differently than adults do. Like they view things differently, they interact differently, their realities are very different than that of an adult. And a lot of that has to do with their cognitive development and cognitive abilities. Babies have a very different way of interacting with the world than like a 2 to 7 year old versus a 7 to 11 year old would, or an adult, right, or adolescent. And so this person here, Jean Piaget, is probably the most famous of the cognitive psychologists who talked about how babies grow and develop over time and the changes and things that they go through mentally or cognitively as they're starting to learn about the world around them. So there are 4 different stages, and we'll talk about each one of them on the coming slides, starting with the first one. So I'll write them up here as well. But stage 1 is called sensory motor. The sensory motor stage, and this is roughly like birth to 2 years old. And in this stage, babies are learning sensory and motor skills. Really nicely named, sensory motor. Just think of the name itself. It tells you everything that's going on here. Babies, when they're very little, are all about like touching, grasping, hearing everything, their senses, right? Using their senses, learning what they mean, learning how to use them. And babies put everything in their mouth, everything. Things that you don't want them to put in their mouth, they put it in their mouth. If they see it on the floor, in the mouth, like everything, right? It's very, very common. They're trying to understand the world around them using their senses. And they're learning motor skills like the ones we just talked about, sitting, crawling, walking, and so on. So in this first stage of the world and of cognitive development, Piaget talked about just trying to understand the world around you using your senses and then learning to interact with the world through motor skills. And he talked about in every stage, there's kind of something that children either like demonstrate or learn in that stage. This one, it's object permanence. Very, very young children do not have object permanence, which means that things that are out of sight are also out of mind. And so as we get older, we understand that if I took my chalk that I have right here and I put it behind my back, you all know it's still there. Like, unless I'm like a magician, which I'm not, and I magically make it disappear, like it's still there. But a baby, you do this and it's gone from the world, which is why babies love peekaboo so much, right? If you ever are stuck with like a 6 to 8 month old child or younger, peekaboo is like your game of choice, because when you do this, you have vanished from the world, because their brain doesn't understand that this, like that you're still there. And so when you go like this and you go peekaboo, they will laugh and giggle because you just came out of nowhere. Like they just completely don't understand that. And so you can entertain them for quite some time with peekaboo when they're very little. But then when they get older, right, they understand that you're still there and it loses its fun in a sense. So babies, like if you don't want them to play with a toy, you just get rid of the toy, you put it out of sight, and then they'll forget about it. But if they're a little bit older and you put it behind your back, they'll just try and reach for it because they understand that it's still there. So object permanence is a big thing that they're learning at this stage, that around 8 months old or so, they start to understand that just because it's out of sight doesn't mean it's out of mind. Right? And they start to get this with people too. We call this object permanence. Objects doesn't always have to mean a thing. It can also mean a person. And so even at around like 8 months or so, they start to understand that just because a person is gone doesn't mean that they're gone forever, that they'll be back. They're starting to get that idea that people can be permanent as well. So again, if you're ever stuck with a 6 to 8 month old baby, peekaboo, that's your go-to. It'll work for a while at least. As we get a little bit older, we go into the pre-operational. The pre-operational stage, somewhere around like 2 to 7 years of age. And what Piaget said is that in this stage, children are too young to perform complex mental operations. They are pre-operational. They are before that ability. And so what he thought like really marked this period of time, and the way you could tell, is that children are very egocentric. And some people never really outgrow this, right? But children are very much this way, where everything is about them. Their perspective is the whole world. They're not able to take another person's point of view. They're not able to have like empathy. You could tell a 6-year-old, I have a headache, and they don't really know what that means. They can't understand what you would feel like because the world is about them. If they're hungry, you're hungry. If they're tired, you must be tired. Everything they experience is what other people must be feeling too. They tend to have an inability to see things from another person's perspective, right? And that starts to change somewhere around like 6 to 7 years old. But when we're very, very little, that's how they tend to be. If they see something or understand something, that is the reality for everyone. They're just not able to see it from somebody else's point of view quite yet. So they are interacting with the world in a very like egotistical way, just because they aren't able to put themselves in somebody else's shoes quite yet. Yeah. So oftentimes with things like autism or autistic spectrum disorder, you often start to see that from a very young age. You might not see it so much here, but by this stage, you will start to see it more. And it's a spectrum disorder, so some people have it very mild, and others it can be very profound. If it's profound, you would probably see it much earlier. But if it's milder, maybe even moderate, you might not see it till somewhere in here, where they maybe aren't developing language at the same pace as you would expect, or they're having difficulty understanding and relating to the world. So oftentimes, yeah, you would really start to see it in about this stage here, unless it was severe, in which case you might see it much earlier.
So what age would they start like using words? Because I work with a kid and he's 3 and he's completely nonverbal.
He's 3, you said, and not verbal. Yeah, and that's really late, right? So oftentimes first words, kids will start to babble very young, like ma, 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 da, 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 like that kind of like really like one syllable kind of things. but somewhere around like a year to 15 months, you start getting words, so really proud of this one, guys. My daughter's Paisley's first word was touchdown. You have no idea how much I love that. She would go, ta-down, ta-down. I'm like, oh my God, I love you, right? My daughter said touchdown. My other one was no and okay. And then, uh-oh. My daughter Kai would go around the house, uh-oh, 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 around like 13 months of age. And so what you see is typically in that like 13, 14 month range, people start to get their first word beyond just like babbling. And then like, even by the time they're 2, they typically have like several words that they're using. They might even be able to put like 2 words together or 3 words together. So to not be verbalizing and using words at 3 is definitely a little bit of a concern, right? That's not typical. It might be that child catches up. Sometimes babies are just a little slower and then they catch up rapidly, or it could be a sign that something, bigger is going on. Yeah, by 3, usually they have quite a bit of like what we call telegraphic speech, where you can like make little sentences and put things together and communicate, not great, but able to communicate a little bit.
If one sibling is on the spectrum, like does that affect the other sibling? Like
Make them more likely, or what do you mean?
Yeah.
Not necessarily, right? So if there are different pregnancies, right? If they were in the same, like if they were twins, then yes, it might be more likely. But if there are different pregnancies, then not necessarily. It could be very related to like the process of pregnancy, that something kind of went wrong, or there were substances that affected them, or it could be somewhat genetic, but it doesn't necessarily make them more likely unless they're maybe in the same pregnancy. Yeah.
Could it also be due to nurture, like we know spectrum?
A little bit more. The way that it might manifest with nurture would be like some kind of trauma as a child. So maybe like I hate to say that they were like dropped in some way, or their oxygen was limited in some way. It would be more those things that might contribute to like a developmental problem. It's typically thought to be more like biological in nature, right? For example, Down syndrome, is related to like having an extra chromosome, or that 21st chromosome. A lot of them are a little bit more like biological, but if there was an environmental trauma, that could definitely cause issues. For sure. Oh, yeah, sorry, I didn't hear.
Like, if you teach like a baby, like different languages during like their early stages,
Yeah.
they'll understand it more later on in life.
Mhm.
Being stage,
Yeah.
they're most likely understand from different types of languages, and these are the changes in between them.
Sure, or even earlier, because kids start to mimic the sounds that they hear, right? So if you're speaking English, those are the sounds and like pronunciations and things that they're going to hear, and that's what they'll start to mimic. And so you can even start earlier than like 2 to 7 of exposing them to different sounds. So like my partner's father speaks like fluent Spanish, right? Like he grew up in like Mexico, speaks fluent Spanish. And so like from a young age, he would speak to our kids in Spanish, right? And we're like, go for it. Like that's just them just hearing other like languages and other sounds. And then, yeah, in this stage, if you start to have a child learn another language, they will learn it much faster and pick up those sounds much better than they will later in life. We learn languages much easier when we're young than we do when we're older. The older we get, the harder it is to pick up a new language. You still can, obviously, but it's much easier when we're little, especially like in this range here.
And like they don't need like any explanation of what it means or anything like that. They just like understand it like right off the bat.
No, I mean, they don't even understand their primary language off the bat, right? Like kids will point at a dog and say cat, 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 cat. No, that's a dog. Oh, dog, dog, dog. And then they'll point at a cat and say dog, right? Like, so they don't understand in the beginning what anything means. And so it's a process of learning in whatever language, what things are. Because oftentimes they'll learn one word. Like Emma learned the word dog. One of her first words was gog. She was trying to say dog, but it was gog. And she'd point to everything and say gog. Like whether it was a cat, a dog, a person, gog, 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 gog. No, that's a cat. Gog, cat, gog. Like they don't get it for a period of time. So whatever language it is, they're still trying to figure all that out. So after the preoperational stage, they go to concrete operation. Concrete operational is 7 to 11 years of age. And so here you can perform like concrete operations. You can think about the world in very concrete ways. And some of us are more concrete thinkers anyway. I'm very much this way. Like if you tell me something, I think about it as it is, right? And other people are more abstract and more like symbolic. This is like taking things very literally, and that's how kids tend to be in this age, right? And something that they learn in this age is a term called conservation. Conservation has to do with this fact that we can alter the way things look, but not necessarily change the amount, right? And so there's a very famous experiment. I have a clip of it, but like for whatever reason, the computer isn't letting me play DVDs. I could try one more time here, but I don't know why. Oh, look, now it loaded. Like I just needed to try again. Awesome. I'm glad I tried again. Like I was trying to load it earlier and it wasn't working. So conservation is a skill that children learn. And when they're really little, they just don't get it. But as they get older, they start to grasp this idea. And the idea is that we could take two things that look the same, manipulate them, and see if they still understand that they're the same or not. This is easier to see than explain. So let me play this for you. And then you can, then we can talk about it a little bit to them. But when they do get it, it's so obvious. Like, yeah, you poured it in there. So yeah, they're the same. And that's the idea behind conservation, that I can alter the way that things look. And someone who's little and doesn't have conservation yet won't get it. But when they get a little bit older, they understand it very clearly. And I did this with my brother when I was little. I remember when I was in a community college. My youngest brother was like 4 or 5 years old. And I was learning about conservation in my psychology class, my intro to psych class. And so I went home and tried it with my brother. They were fighting. I have 2 brothers, right? As you know now. My 2 brothers were fighting about hot dogs. Like my mom had made them hot dogs for lunch. And my littlest brother was all upset because my older brother's hot dog was bigger. And I thought that was funny. I immaturely like laughed at that for a good amount of time, that they were comparing hot dog size, and thought it was hilarious. But I was like, can I try something? And I took my littlest brother's hot dog and I cut it up into 4 pieces and gave it back to him. And he looked at my other brother and he's like, look how much more I have than you now. Right? Like he was so proud of himself that he had so much more hot dog because it was 4 pieces. Even though it was the same hot dog cut into 4, right? He didn't understand yet this idea. And so it's really interesting. Little kids just don't grasp this all the way. And so you can kind of manipulate this a little bit at times. Like you give one a quarter and they don't understand the value of money. So the other one, you give 2 pennies and they're like, I have so much more than you. Right? And you can just laugh because you know better as an adult. All right. So this is something that they're learning in this stage, like the idea of conservation and being able to think about the world in very like concrete or absolute kind of terms. The last stage that we go through is called formal operations. And then the formal operational stage, which is basically like 12 and beyond, you're learning to think about the world in more like abstract kind of ways. You're learning critical thinking. You're learning how to reason and systematically like use logic. And you can think outside of the box. Right? I love this. Like everyone else is in a square frame and this one is round. It's like, wow, genius, right? Like never would have thought to do that. Kids, when they're 12 and older, start to use more abstract thinking, use more like symbolic ways of thinking about the world, make up their own mind. They can think about things very differently. And this is a skill that we're developing all the way through our teenage years and into adulthood, right? Learning to think critically and think outside of the box. And so again, like what Piaget's idea here was that you can tell like this progression that children think about the world very differently depending on what stage that they're in. And it isn't like 100% correct in that children, you know, these are averages. Some are much earlier or later than others, but it's very common that we see children progress in this way, right? That they learn to think about the world differently. And they have different things that tend to characterize different ages in terms of how they interact with the world around them. Any other thoughts or comments, questions, anything? Again, if you have little kids in your life, you can see these things in action. It's very easy to see them. And again, these are averages. Some are earlier and some are later. All right. So I think what I'll do, I'm going to stop there at 9:36 rather than get into this and like have to rush through it. And so what we'll do, I won't see you Monday after break, remember? So I hope you all have a wonderful, long, relaxing break. Do something fun, take some time for yourself and relax, whatever that might be. When we come back, we'll keep going with this. We'll finish up. Next time I see you, we'll go through adolescence and adulthood. But yeah, have a wonderful break. Don't forget to sign in before you leave. And I'll see you in I'll see you in a week and a half. I hope I'm like 10 pounds fatter when I see you next. In my group. I am wishing it hard and ready. I'm sorry, what was that? Yes, let me just stop this.